I'm David Pierce, and this is Protocol Source Code, brought to you by Chainalysis. Today on the show, we're going to talk about the latest in the crazy back and forth about office reopenings, vaccine mandates, and hybrid work. We're also going to talk about a new bill in the Senate that could be the most disruptive piece of legislation to hit Congress yet, at least as far as the tech industry is concerned. But first, can we talk about foldable phones for just a second? So, in case you didn't know, Samsung launched some new phones this week.
For so long, so much has been closed. But today, life opens up with the Galaxy.
So there's two phones to know about.
We're introducing two new foldables that you will love, starting with Galaxy Z Fold 3. Check out that gorgeous design.
Introducing the Galaxy Z Flip 3. It's our most stylish smartphone yet.
One opens like a flip phone, the other opens horizontally like a notebook. Samsung's been at this kind of technology for a while, and the tech seems to be getting better fast. The screens don't fall apart or have weird films on them anymore, so that's all good things. But there's still this big open question, which is, so what? The case for these devices, as far as I can tell, is basically that you can get a bigger screen on something that fits in your pocket. So that means lots of companies are positioning these as a sort of all-in-one device. It's a smartphone when you want it, and a tablet or even a laptop when you'd rather have that. But the pitch continues to just be, look, more screen, more room to do screen stuff.
With the Z Fold 3, you'll be able to do so much more than you could on a regular smartphone. This foldable puts new possibilities at your fingertips. Once you've experienced its large display, you won't want to go back.
Here's my takeaway from this whole thing right now. Foldable phones are going to be a thing. For a while, it looked like a weird tech demo science project, but they're going to be a thing. Samsung's actually ahead of the pack here, but I think others are going to catch up. And this basic shape and form factor, both the flippable and the foldable, is going to get a chance to be the next big thing in smartphones. But the big hurdle left is for someone to figure out what a foldable phone can do that's different and special, and that you can't just do with having a candy bar piece of glass in your pocket. Think of what Instagram did when suddenly everybody had a camera in their pocket, or Uber did when suddenly everybody had a device location in their pocket. Something like that, but for foldables, is the way that this will work. Otherwise, I'm not sure. I will say, though, the Flip 3 looks kind of great, and I really do miss having a phone that I could just slam shut to end phone calls. Anyway, let's move on and talk about a new bill in the Senate that would, and I don't think I'm being hyperbolic here, totally upend the way the App Store works. It's just one bill and it's just been introduced, but you can absolutely guarantee that executives at Google and Apple are sweating right now. Ben Brody covered the bill for us this week, so I called him to get his take on what's new. If I am remembering correctly, and there's a decent chance I'm not, this bill that came out this week is the first sort of real, head-on, let's do something about the App Store bill to come into Congress. Is that right? Am I missing something?
So it is the most serious pointed one. There might have been a one-off in the House. One loses track. There's 435 of them. But this is a subcommittee chairwoman who is putting this out. It's actually two, the subcommittee chairwoman, subcommittee chairman, who are putting this out. It is really serious. What's sort of interesting about it is that you could kind of look at the House antitrust's non-discrimination bill from a couple months ago as achieving some similar aims, even though it wasn't necessarily pointed as explicitly or definitionally in the same direction. And so what makes this really interesting is it's kind of a different approach from that House approach. The non-discrimination bill, that's sort of a principle. This is a thing you can't do generally, and we'll get there. There'll be some legal precedent that'll develop over 20 years. We'll have some regulations, we'll get there eventually. And this bill is no, this is a thing we don't like, and we're going to create a set of definitions that more or less capture it. And we're going to set a monetary threshold that basically only makes it for Apple and Google. And that's what we're going to do. So it is the first one, which makes it pretty interesting, first major one in that way. But it also, I think, illustrates the difference between the House and Senate approaches in some ways.
Got it. Okay. So give me the sort of greatest hits of the bill. It aims to do a lot, but there are sort of a few specific things in there that seem to jump out.
Yeah. So one of the really big ones is protecting sideloading. If you're Apple, it's forcing sideloading on you. That's really huge. Third-party apps, third-party app stores, third-party payment processors, all those things that Apple uses to really monetize its hold on the iOS app environment. It's basically sort of dismantling all those things, and you can imagine that Apple's really unhappy about all of that. There's also banning anti-steering provisions, those things that stop the app from saying, hey, you can get this for 30% less if you just like download it from our website, if you just subscribe through netflix.com. There's also some things about like how you surface apps. Like you can't degrade Gmail because you're Apple and you have Apple Mail unless it's like a legitimate security concern. And that's something that a lot of smaller apps, they'll say like, well, we compete against Apple, and so they won't surface us on search, so nobody can even discover and download us. And that's of course debatable, but they're pretty happy about it. They also can't use the third-party data that they're getting about the downloads and things like that to compete against the apps.
Okay, so if Epic is the one that jumps out, but any of these companies, Spotify or any of the folks who have been sort of railing on the bad practices of the App Store, this is just like a clean sweep victory, right? This seems like everything they've asked for all in one piece of legislation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure that they had a hand in it. I'm sure it's not an accident in any way, shape, or form. As you said, it reads like they wrote it. It reads like they got everything that they wanted in here. It is really designed around their specific sets of concerns. Spotify, Match, Epic, primarily, like Tile a little bit, but like really those three in a huge way, and kind of what the Coalition for App Fairness that they all stood up together was really asking for. When you talk to some of those folks behind the scenes, they'll tell you, yeah, we liked the House non-discrimination approach. We think it would have gotten us there eventually, but they were like, this is the one that we're really committed to. And it's interesting that the politics of it too, the Senate is just harder to get legislation through. And a bipartisan bill in the Senate is probably slightly, as amazing as it was that all the House bills were bipartisan, it's even more amazing that this is bipartisan.
Well, and that's kind of why I want to talk about this, because, we've talked about antitrust stuff before on the show, and it always comes back to one of the biggest challenges about this is if you rewrite the antitrust rules, you rewrite the antitrust rules for everybody. And you're going to bring in like airlines, which are going to have a different fight. And so it's like, I've reached a point where it's like, okay, someday in the future, we will probably have a different definition of how antitrust works, but it's probably going to be watered down and small and different, and like it isn't going to accomplish what a lot of people think it's going to accomplish in the tech industry. This one is like Dear Apple and Google, and just like shoves a knife into both of them, which I'm guessing was pretty deliberate, right? Like to your point that they came out and were like, okay, we don't want to do anything. We don't want to worry about what Delta Airlines is going to think about this. Like we are coming for Google and Apple specifically. Let's go.
Let's go. Let's do it. No, I think that's totally true. And it's not what the Senate has been doing. It's more what the House has been doing. And on this one, the Senate was like, yeah, totally. Let's go for it. Let's make a statement about where we think there's antitrust harm going on, but let's just make a statement about like how we think this market should operate. Let's just make a statement about what we think the norm should be, whether it's anti-competitive or not. Like we don't want app stores to work like this, and we are senators in 2021, and you can eat it, Apple.
Yeah. I mean, there is an interesting thing that seems to be happening where everyone seems to be slowly realizing that there are more ways to do this than just antitrust. It's like somebody finally poked senators and was like, hey, you can just write laws about this stuff, right? Like there are no laws about any of this stuff. Just write some laws.
We're a republic. You make the laws. You can go make some laws if you don't like a thing. Yeah, which is really interesting. And it has its own political dimensions because antitrust is still the buzzword.
Right.
And so people think that it's like kind of how you're supposed to do it. But they are senators. They are Congress. They are literally called lawmakers. They can make laws.
Yeah. Do you think this is going to be the next thing? Are we going to, instead of taking this sort of big, giant antitrust behemoth and trying to solve it, they're just going to start like carving out every tiny piece of it they can and try to sort of legislate their way to the same thing, but in the opposite direction? That honestly seems like a way more achievable strategy if I'm Congress.
It does, except then you have to pick at every little problem, and you have to get 40 bills through. It's not clear to me where Klobuchar is going. The things that she's talked about, she literally has a book called Antitrust. The things that she's talked about are so all sector. And I should say she's on this bill. Mm-hmm. She is the chairwoman of the subcommittee on antitrust law. She has talked about these things that she's concerned about in ag and that she's concerned about in the defense industry and all these kinds of other things, in airplanes, I should say. And so I would not be surprised if she actually kind of does go back to, hey, how do we change mergers in this really high level way? How do we change monopolization conduct in this really high level way. I would not be surprised if she went back, but when that package is arriving and what it looks like, and if it does have a component that is specific to tech, that's, I think, what we're waiting to see.
So you've conditioned me over time to believe that any bill that I see, no matter how legitimate or high-powered it seems to be, is probably nothing like the thing that will end up passing. So I'll ask you the same question I always ask you, which is handicap the odds of this thing becoming real for me.
I think it's a little more serious. I think as you get toward the end of the process, as you get closer to things that the chairwoman introduces, I think as you get more bipartisan, it starts to look more like what can happen. I think as you get closer, the Senate it's harder to get things through the Senate, and like the person who's more pig-headed sort of tends to win the argument. So there's like, in Congress, they sort of say, like, the Senate often writes the final legislation. That's just sort of a fact. So I think this is probably getting closer. But yeah, I mean, Apple will be in there trying to drill loopholes through this. There's no doubt about that. People will try to attach other kinds of conduct to it. Other kinds of apps will say, like, hey, our intellectual property stuff isn't in there. Like, I want to see, is Tile going to go in there and start talking about that kind of thing? I would not at all be surprised if there were a lot of changes and amendments that happen as it goes through this committee process. But I think we're a little bit farther along in terms of the iterative process, which is a term I hate, but it is kind of truthfully how it goes a lot of times.
And have we heard anything new from Apple or Google? I mean, we've heard their defense against this exact thing so many times now because it just keeps coming up. Have we learned anything new as a result of this bill about how they plan to defend themselves?
They are really keeping kind of mum on these things. I mean, look, privacy and security are pretty powerful things, I think, particularly for Apple. We're seeing this whole flare up on the encryption debate and their child protection measures that's still going a week after they sort of blew it up last week. I think it's a really powerful argument for them that, like, normally they're known as the privacy security people. And I think they're being able to trot that out will probably be really important for them. But it's kind of a fraught time. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if we had a decision in Apple Epic in the next couple of weeks. And so, that could be, it's a fraught time. They got a lot on their plates right now.
Yeah. And they seem to be fighting the exact same fight on a bunch of different fronts all at once. Like the Apple Epic thing is just the same argument with the same people on the same sides, just in a different place. Like, it's just all of these things. And I wonder if they all end up in different places, how we're going to even start to sort of reconcile the legal precedent with the legislative process. And like, it's going to be messy, but the sides now are so clearly drawn that it does feel like this is now just the parameters of the fight that we're going to have for however long it has to take.
Well, we have a court version and a Congress version of it, but we probably have a Justice Department version of it too, where they're all complaining and the lawyers are negotiating with the enforcers too. So we have all three branches of government going here, no doubt about it.
It's good times. And there's a House bill along these lines too, right? What's the deal there?
It's a companion bill, which it's also bipartisan. Interestingly, so it's from Ken Buck, the top Republican on the antitrust subcommittee, Hank Johnson, who's one of the Democrats on that committee. It is bipartisan. It is moving forward. And I think that maybe makes it a little bit more plausible that is what the agreement looks like. But of course, it takes a long time to get all the legislators on board.
Fair enough. But it does seem like, I think like you were saying before, the House has thought about this very differently than the Senate has until now. But it's interesting that the House is kind of coming around to sort of thinking about this process along the same lines. And maybe to your point means there's more agreement than we even have realized in the past about how this stuff should be executed on.
Yeah, I think so. And there's a weird play that I think Cicilline's doing where, like, some of his bills are sort of like moving the rhetorical field goals, and then some are things that they actually hope they can advance.
Right.
And where this plays and all of that is the 3D chess of all these things.
It is another one of those things where either this is incredibly chaotic and haphazard, or there is a truly remarkable plan behind it all. And it's sort of so hard to know which one it is.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Ben. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back to talk about the latest in Tech's plan to get back to the office.
Chainalysis is the blockchain data platform. Our data powers investigations and compliance software that organizations in the public and private sectors use to fulfill regulatory obligations, investigate criminal cases, and recover digital assets.
A few months ago, it looked like everything was headed in the right direction. People were getting vaccinated, cases were dropping, companies were starting to make plans to head back to the office and get back to whatever normal looks like. But now, thanks to the Delta variant, a slowdown in vaccinations, and an uptick in cases, it feels like a lot of uncertainty is back. Allison Levitsky on our team has been covering the latest moves in the tech industry because companies big and small are trying to figure out what to do this fall. So I called her to get the latest. I think the place I want to start is with vaccine mandates, which feel to me like they've become something like just the norm, that it's sort of the assumed thing that a company is going to do, which is mandate vaccines for people who want to come back to the office. Is that fair? Am I overstating the state of things?
I think it is becoming much more common among the largest companies. Amazon is still not. They have not announced a vaccine mandate. There are several other large companies that have not. I haven't heard anything from, say, Airbnb. I haven't heard anything from Apple. Haven't heard anything from Intel. So yes, Facebook's doing this, Google's doing this, Microsoft's doing this, Lyft, Uber, Adobe, companies like that. Now Hewlett Packard Enterprise, some smaller companies.
And is your sense that there's any pushback on that stuff? One of the things that amazes me is these things have been rolled out, and as far as I can tell, which is mostly just like on Twitter and in occasional conversations, people are just kind of nodding and being like, yeah, that makes sense. But I would have thought this would be super controversial.
I don't think in any widespread way. I think that when you announce a policy around something that's so politically charged, any group of thousands or tens of thousands of employees, you're going to have some pushback. But I think the dominant feeling is this makes sense. And I think that there's a non-trivial number of employees who don't want to come back to the office unless they know everyone's vaccinated.
Okay. And have there been many companies that have said explicitly, like, no, this is not a thing we're going to do, and making that sort of political stance like you're talking about, the like, you know, what the governors of Texas and Florida are doing and saying, screw you and your vaccine mandate?
I don't think anything quite so politically charged. And I think that with all of these announcements, so many of them get walked back, you know, within a week or two or a month. And so I think people are generally wary of, you know, committing to something that much.
That's fair. That's the part that to me seems the most different from where we were, like, I don't know, 6 months ago. I go back to like the early spring, and there was a sense of like, okay, people are getting vaccinated. We're on our way out of this. We can start to make real plans and kind of know where we're going. And now I get the sense people are just like, we don't know. Everything's chaos. All we can do is just sort of ride it out one day at a time. Like, does it feel that way to you too?
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, for a while, it was feeling like October was the new September, and several major companies still say they'll reopen in October, but Facebook announced they won't go back until January, and they're part of a pretty long list of big companies that are not going to go back until next year. So yeah, I mean, I think that probably other announcements like that are still to come, that there will be more delays.
What's your sense of how companies have figured out how all of this is going to work? Because I think one of the things you and I have been talking a bunch about is like just the logistics of something like this, where I think, what was it, the Excelsior Pass in New York that you can trick with a food menu? It's like the systems we have that are out there sort of in public are not very good, but presumably these companies are going to have to figure out a way to actually do real verification. Do you have any sense of if folks have figured this out yet?
I think when I've asked some of the major companies about it, well, not everyone wants to talk publicly about what they're doing on that front. I get the sense that they're still figuring it out. A lot of the proof that companies collect is going to come in the form of vaccine cards and photos of vaccine cards. Not everyone lives in California or New York, where you have sort of a digital version. Right. And of course, vaccine cards are pretty easy to forge or to buy a fake one online. You know, I would have to think that it will be a very small number of people who try to fake them. I don't think that a significant number of people would do that, but it's certainly something that companies are going to have to at least be thinking about.
Yeah, I do wonder if there's going to be a whole startup ecosystem around vaccine stuff that is just like There are all these companies are going to exist for like 1 year and just show up to help companies figure out how to deal with this. Because it does feel like it's just going to be a lot of like emailing photos to HR. And that is just a bizarre system, especially in these giant companies.
Yeah. I mean, either emailing or using a system like Workday or ServiceNow or something. I think that those are kind of the three that I've heard the most.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, and then the other thing that seems to be happening that you've been covering a bunch is, and this goes back to, I guess, companies just saying the only thing we can do is take it day by day, that the push towards more flexible work schedules seems to be getting like ever more flexible all the time. And all the companies who are saying, well, you can work from home 1 day a week, or we're coming all the way back, are now kind of unwinding that. Is there what's your sense of kind of where the new sort of normal has settled as far as how companies are thinking about that?
Mm-hmm. Well, some of the major companies are still going with a less flexible hybrid model where they, Google still says they'll have their employees come in 3 or more days a week. Apple's still in that boat. I think that across the board, things are getting more flexible rather than less. I think that is probably what companies are going to need to adapt to if they want to retain talent. So I think that will continue to be the direction. There's always these outliers who say that they want to keep their in-office culture, but those are a pretty tiny minority.
Is it strange to you that the big companies by and large seem to be less flexible than the startups? I feel like I've heard many more startups say we're going fully remote. Even companies up to sort of the size of like a Dropbox are saying, we're going virtual first, digital first, whatever you want to call it. But the biggest handful of companies seem to be the ones pushing the most to get people back. What do you make of that?
Gosh, that's a great question. I wonder if it's just the challenge of building and retaining company culture at such a large scale. I think with a startup, just the day-to-day of communicating with your team, you can, with a smaller group of people, you can do that with all the Zooms and the Slacks and everything. I think that when, and I think the second piece might be a real estate investment thing. I mean,
true, yeah.
Google, Apple, Facebook, these are companies that have put so much money into their campuses. They continue to build campuses, especially in Google's case. They kind of, their culture comes from all their cool on-site perks. And I think that it's hard to imagine a remote Google. I don't think that's the future that we're heading towards.
Actually. Yeah. I just keep waiting for Tim Cook to come out and say, listen, everybody, we spent $5 billion on this campus. You are coming back to it. And it's like, all right, like fair enough. I guess I understand the logic of that. So what's your sense of what folks are doing right now? I mean, we're in this totally uncertain phase. Everybody is just kind of making these plans, talking about vaccine mandates. The mask mandate is back for a lot of places across the US. But it feels in so many ways like we're back in this position of kind of not knowing what is coming and when. And I think it felt like the light was at the end of the tunnel. And it's like, it still kind of is, but it doesn't seem like it's getting any closer anymore. And I'm like butchering this metaphor now. But when you talk to folks who are sort of sitting around making these decisions like day by day, what are they thinking about kind of right now?
Everyone says it's about the data. They're watching the case counts. I think everyone says, we care about safety. We also care about company culture. We care about productivity. So I think it's, this is not a surprise, but I think everyone sees it as a balancing act between the two. I mean, it's kind of an interesting question when, especially if you know that the vast majority of your employees are vaccinated, whether to come back. It's sort of a test of what your company values and I guess what level of risk they're willing to take. And I think the science and the guidance from government agencies is also just changing so quickly that it's just, it's hard for a regular person to keep up with.
Part of what's so interesting about this is there was a moment in what was it? It was like last summer, I guess, that was the moment where all the companies kind of all at once were like, look, we don't know, call us in a year. And it was like right when the school year started, if I remember correctly. It was everybody's like, listen, settle down, hunker down, do what you got to do. We will come back in June. Like, just the school year is going to be like this. We'll come back. And part of me wonders if like we're about to hit roughly that same point again. And I don't think the situation is quite so dire, but I do wonder if some of the folks are having the same conversations where it's like, if my kids are about to start school or I'm about to come back from vacation or whatever, like people want some sense of normalcy. And we're kind of back in this weird wait and see chaos period. And it's so hard to know what to do.
Yeah, especially for people who have relocated. They've left places like the Bay Area to go live somewhere closer to family or what have you. That's something that I hear often from executives is we need to give people some sense of they know how to plan for the next 6 or 9 months of their life. So sometimes it makes sense to just play it safe and kind of say you can keep working remotely for a few more months.
Yeah, it's gonna be interesting to see, but it does feel like the uncertainty is going to linger a little while longer, and the folks you talk to are just learning how to get comfortable with that again. That it felt like it was almost over, and now it's probably not almost over, and it's just like the sort of head shift of that has been an interesting challenge, I think, for everybody.
Yeah, I mean the thing about this current spike in cases is it just feels different than it did a few months ago. It feels different than before most of us were vaccinated, or many of us were vaccinated. It's just I just day to day, I think people are wondering, how careful should I be right now if I'm vaccinated? What risks should I be taking? And so that is, I think, on kind of that question. But when you're making decisions for a group of hundreds or thousands of people, kind of what these companies are dealing with.
That's true. There's so much of it now that the advice is just like, do, whatever makes you feel comfortable. And I'm even asking this question too. Like, I've been vaccinated since April, and still I'm like, should I be wearing masks places? Like, should I be hanging out with people? What places are acceptable to go? And it's true. It's one thing to sort through those decisions for yourself, which are complicated. It's another to make them for like hundreds or thousands or hundreds of thousands of people, all of whom are in totally different life situations, which does make me wonder if maybe kicking the can a ways down the road like Airbnb did might become a pretty popular decision. That's like, do what makes you, our office is open, do what makes you feel comfortable. We'll worry about it again in 12 months. I wonder if that's going to be a thing that people start to say.
Maybe. Yeah, we'll see.
Fair enough. All right. Well, thank you, Allison. Appreciate it.
Thanks, David.
Before we go, here's a few things to look out for this week. There's not much, honestly, because, it's mid-August and things are dead. But Tesla's AI Day is on Thursday, and those events are always interesting. Plus, we do get earnings from Roblox and NVIDIA, so there should be some interesting info on all things metaverse and chip shortage. Oh, and Tencent also reports earnings, so we should hear more about China's crackdown on the tech industry and what that's causing. We'll come back to all of that next week. But for now, that's it for the show. Thanks to Ben and Allison for being here, and thank you so much for listening. You can subscribe to Source Code anywhere you get podcasts. Please rate us if you can, and sign up to get the Source Code email newsletter every day at protocol.com/newsletters. Have a great one. We'll talk to you soon.
Chainalysis is the blockchain data platform. Our data powers investigations and compliance software that organizations in the public and private sectors use to fulfill regulatory obligations, investigate criminal cases, and recover digital assets.